Buddhism in the Time of COVID conference, my talk is going to be based on the book The Plague, which was published in 1947 by the French writer and philosopher Albert Camus. As you can imagine, with a title like The Plague, the book is experiencing somewhat of a spike in sales around the world, and much of the mainstream publishing media, like the New York Times, The Guardian, and The Australian, have revisited this book, providing articles in the past few weeks to draw some parallels and some inspiration from it. Now, of course, this book doesn't so much as mention the word Buddhism. However, Albert Camus is widely viewed as an existentialist philosopher, and it is my view, and the view of many minds more scholarly than mine, that existentialism and Buddhism have an enormous amount in common, as I will be exploring in my talk today. It's definitely a significant work, or a literary classic, and Albert Camus won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, about 10 years after this was published, for his whole body of work. The introduction tells you that it was translated into 9 languages within the first year, and that it's never been out of print. So the story is set in a French town on the coast of Algeria called Oran, which is like Iran but with an O. And Camus sounds pretty uninspired by the lifestyle in Oran, which he describes thus: "Our citizens work hard, but solely with the object of getting rich. Their chief interest is in commerce, and their chief aim in life is, as they call it, doing business." So the story begins when the people of Oran start noticing dead rats lying around, and these dead rats start to literally pile up, and people start becoming ill. The numbers of cases rise, first slowly, then exponentially, with over 100 deaths a day starting to become normal. In these early days, however, as with our own plague, people are in denial. Quote, "Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise." And one character says, "It's impossible it should be the plague. Everyone knows it has vanished from the West." Another recurring theme in the book is that of loneliness and the pain of separation from loved ones. Quote, "A quite individual feeling, such as being separated from a loved one, suddenly became, in the very first weeks, the feelings of a whole people, and together with fear, the greatest agony of that long period of exile." So restrictions are put in place, the city gates are shut, martial law is declared, the port is closed, sporting events stop, swimming at the beach is prohibited. Next come food shortages, isolation, lockdowns. Hospitals are beyond capacity so that schools and public buildings become makeshift plague hospitals. Places of worship shut down, funerals are banned, and the living can no longer even farewell the dead. One of the main commonalities between existentialist philosophy and Buddhism is the focus on death and how acknowledging it can bring so much meaning to life. As we all know, there's a Buddhist tradition for monks to meditate in cemeteries, for example. In The Plague, there is a long, drawn-out scene where a young child suffers a long, painful death, surrounded by some of the main characters. And there are also long descriptions which go for pages and pages of the effect of the plague on the burying of the dead. In fact, for Camus, taking all his work as a whole, the main philosophical question he posed, or the starting point for all philosophical inquiry, is, should I commit suicide? A little bit like the Shakespearean to be or not to be. One of the characters in The Plague does attempt but fail to commit suicide quite early in the book, and throughout the story this particular character is not portrayed as a good decision maker. Rather, he eventually finds ways to profit from the plague and lives in hope that it will last a long time. Camus did not believe suicide was the answer, but interestingly, he thought there were two ways to commit suicide. There was, of course, physical suicide, but also philosophical suicide. He saw philosophical suicide as all the ways we humans come up with to avoid confronting the questions raised by our own lives. Instead of living in the here and now and embracing whatever our life is asking of us, we commit philosophical suicide by letting others come up with the answers for us. We all crave certainty, so we let ourselves be taken in by fundamentalist religions that claim to have the answers. Exhibited, for example, in the book by the priest who ranted that the plague was punishment for sin. Or we let ourselves be taken in by enslavement to social conformity, mainstream culture and values, or just doing what's expected by those around us, all in an effort to avoid engaging or sitting with our own existential angst. So what is existential angst? It's those times when you look at your life and ask, why am I doing this day in, day out? What's the point? But you don't come up with an answer. It's the times when you ask yourself, what should I do with my life to make it more meaningful? And again, you can't think of an answer, or you do think of an answer, you complete a meaningful project, and then what? You're back to where you started. Or catastrophe strikes your family, the effects of coronavirus strikes, and there's no good reason for these things to happen. Bad things happen to good people. You eventually realise the universe does not have your back. It's not looking out for your interests. Everything is in fact completely uncontrollable, unfair, and you're going to die. The people you love are going to die, and you don't get it. Any of it. It's all completely random. Depressing, huh? Depressing, but true. And most humans go to great lengths to avoid these existential realizations. When you let existential angst run its course, you see that human beings are craving meaning and certainty and answers, but they're just not there. It's absurd. And in fact, absurdity is a big buzzword in existentialism. And I like it because it lightens things up a bit. It's all just absurd, and this helps us to cultivate a tragicomic perspective. There's humour in this thing called life. There's joy, and there's love, and there's gratitude, but there's no denying that it's ultimately a tragedy. It is the first noble truth of Buddhism. There is suffering, there is imperfection, stress, unsatisfactoriness. Denial will not make it go away. Embrace it and work with it. Realise that all our fellow humans are in the same boat, so be in solidarity with them. So the message of Buddhism and existentialism is stop avoiding your existential angst, because if all we do is seek pleasure and avoid pain, or numb ourselves with distraction or alcohol or Netflix binges, then we're not leading an authentic life. Existentialists are very into authenticity, seeing it as the greatest human virtue. And by authenticity, they mean acknowledging the truth. We will all suffer and die. Plagues happen, wars happen. Don't live in denial, but make this the starting point from which to shape your life. Embrace the way things are and ask, what does this moment require of me? In one of his essays, Albert Camus drew from Greek mythology to provide a memorable metaphor of our absurd lives. There was a king named Sisyphus who got on the wrong side of the gods and was sentenced to rolling a massive boulder up a hill, only to reach the top of the hill and have the boulder roll back down to the bottom for him to start over again. He was condemned to a lifetime of this punishing task, where all his efforts were futile. The boulder would always roll back down to the bottom of the hill. It's certainly a metaphor for what's happening to a lot of people during the coronavirus. Watching the massive boulder roll down the hill is similar to losing what you've spent years building up. Many could see Sisyphus and his boulder as a metaphor for modern life. Commute, work, sleep, commute, work, sleep, or as the French say, metro, boulot, dodo. But the gods only condemned Sisyphus to push the boulder. They didn't condemn him to resent the process. Camus suggests we imagine Sisyphus smiling while pushing the boulder, understanding the futility of his work, but doing his best to enjoy it. So in existentialism, there is no meaning of life. There is no great offering of answers. But this frees us up to come up with our own meaning of life, which is quite sensible. Why should there be a one-size-fits-all meaning of life? We all have different limitations and conditions. Surely the meaning of life should work on a case-by-case basis. And it doesn't have to be something grandiose. For the main character of The Plague, Dr. Rieux, it seems to have just been doing my job. Dr. Rieux and his 4 or so friends set up teams of voluntary workers to administer serums and ensure that the sick are quickly diagnosed and taken to hospital. Something interesting about Camus' perspective is that he does not believe in saints or superhumans or even heroes. For example, in this passage, Dr. Rieux explains what it all comes down to for him. He says, "There's one thing I must tell you. This whole thing is not about heroism. It's about decency. It may seem a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency." "What is decency?" Rambert asked, suddenly serious. "In general, I can't say," Rieux says, "but in my case, I know that it consists in doing my job." The introduction of The Plague explains that in the late 40s, Camus actually became quite depressed about people's expectations of him as a public intellectual, as they thought he should have come up with a polished world view. But as he expressed through his character Dr. Rieux, he was weary of the world, but still had some feeling for his fellow men and was determined for his part to reject any injustice and any compromise. I appreciate the humility of Dr. Rieux's aspirations, and it reminds me of one of my favourite quotations, which is by Mother Teresa. "Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love." This line of thinking helps me when I get caught up in fantasies of how I will personally feed the masses and make a huge difference and save the world, whereas all most of us can really do is, like Dr. Rieux, our job. And that might be looking after our loved ones or keeping the wheels of our minute little corner of the economy going. Viktor Frankl, who shared his insights after surviving the Holocaust, said that we don't get to choose our difficulties, but we do have the freedom to choose our responses. He said that meaning comes from 3 things: the work we offer in times of crisis, the love we give, and our ability to show courage in times of suffering. After just over a year, The Plague does end, and the book closes with this final and very cheerful note. As he listened to the cries of joy that rose above the town, Rieux recalled that this joy was always under threat. He knew that this happy crowd was unaware of something that one can read in books, which is that the plague bacillus never dies or vanishes entirely, that it can remain dormant for years in furniture and clothing, that it waits patiently in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, handkerchiefs and old papers, and that perhaps the day will come when, for the instructional misfortune of humankind, the plague will rouse its rats and send them to die in some well-contented city. So too will our coronavirus eventually pass. Let's not pass up an opportunity to practice mindfulness of our existential crises, to be brave enough to sit and feel the different impermanent emotions that arise, to be non-judgmental of our various reactions and realise that the answers are not out there but inside us if we can just listen out for them.